So in today's video we're going to cover more stitch patterns to help out anyone that is working on their wallflowers quilt or anything else and they're trying to figure out how to fill up their area. I wanted to mention very quickly that I'm still checking back on the community poll and you can still weigh in on which items are most important to you for supplementary videos for the Wallflower series. I am going to try to hit everything, but it may be that it's not realistic to do all of the subjects. So please, you have to scroll down on the community tab a little ways to get to the poll, but if you have a minute to do that, I'd appreciate knowing your thoughts. I wanted to remind you that while we're doing this kind of work, our 4 concerns that we're trying to keep in mind the whole time are sustainability, because quilting is repetitive, and interdependence, because each of your elements play off of each other, and if you make one decision to do something one way, then it will affect the other elements in your piece. We want flow or movement, not flat and static objects in quilting, and also we're generally going for an organic quality, so we're looking towards biology, not geometry for our shapes. Now, having said that, the first thing I want to cover is something that I think of as being related to a stipple or a meander, which we covered last time. So our first stitch is an angular stipple. This is something that I almost never do anymore. I used to do it quite a bit on my slower machine, and I could usually maneuver the fabric to do that and be happy with the result. But honestly, my big machine goes twice as fast, and I've sort of abandoned the angular stipple because it requires the tension to be nearly perfect for it to look good front and back, and also it's so easy to get pileups in the corners, and there are so many corners and you're stitching such a small distance. The difference between that and the little boxes that we stitched is the little box has, at least in the beginning, a fairly big shape, and then goes down in the center to be a very tiny little box. But this type of angular stipple that I'm talking about, it's all tiny little box shapes, tiny little right angles. And if you do this kind of an angular stipple though, you'll make your own rules. You'll decide, can it be, some of it look like triangles? Can some of it look like a hexagon, whatever? Or is it all supposed to look like the right angles of like a street map with little roads that go around the block or whatever? The next stitch I want to cover I've called cell walls or orange segments or endoplasmic reticulum. But basically it's just a sort of a move where you try to make shapes that will cover area quickly and that you can either cut out or not cut out on your quilting. I like this because you can really do something with those areas that you just don't know what to do, and you need to do something to fill up, and there's just a lot of ways you can play with it and figure out different things you can do. And then when you're finishing off your piece, you can cut a lot of this out, or you don't have to, but it's just something I find myself doing a lot, mostly on purses. I don't do it very often on wall hangings unless they are sort of abstract pieces rather than landscapes. In a way, it's like the veining that you do sometimes on a leaf. Okay, so my mountains, when I do them, tend to just be sort of an attempt to outline the top, not too straight, and then just do some interesting stitching. And when I have a fabric that I've painted or that has mountains, I will kind of follow some of the shapes that are in that design. But I like them to not be too smooth and too weird looking, and I like the lines to not be too smooth. But you know, I mean, not too wiggly. It's just something. I would expect your mountains to look completely different from mine. I live in Montana, where we don't have everything that people have in cities, but one thing we do have is mountains. In fact, when people live here so that they can have lives that go outdoors a lot and enjoy hiking and camping and hunting and all of that, but they can't make as much money as they would in a city, and it's commonly called a mountain tax. But I love mountains. I love to put purple mountains on quilts, and I paint them now. It started with a fabric that was an Asian fabric that had some really awesome mountains, and now I just sort of paint some sort of purple and taupe and white mountains that I can stitch. We did it in one quilt previously, and so I'm just showing you that here. I like to pay attention to the overall shape of the tree and what the edge will trim like. I learned pretty early that, you know, if it looks too like that might be okay, but if it looks too much like this, I don't really like it on the outside edge. But my trees tend to have a lot of knots, which I do kind of a curly Q and go around and then go around. Vary how far apart you are from things. Come through and kind of fill out where you want the tree trunk to be broader. And then, you know, here I could come back up this side if I wanted. But at some point, I've got to really start paying attention to the outside shape of my tree, because you can't just go forever. You can skip areas that you cut out if you've planted an extra layer of fabric under there. And you just end up trying to make it look like a tree. And I find it's okay usually to do, this is not what I would want, but to do the trunk and then, you know, add branches. And I would just start here and come back to it and just turn this into a branch. But when I was in first grade in Missoula, Montana, we had a visiting artist for a day, and we did a project that was to draw a tree. And the tree that they had us draw looked more like a lollipop than a tree. It was a trunk that looked like a stick, and then the crown or leafy part of the tree that looked like a cloud that was green. And that's the tree that everybody else made, and I made my tree with branches and individual leaves. And it took me forever, and I was making my little leaves long after everybody else was finished with their tree. And I have to say, people talk about how their creativity was damaged in school and they weren't able to express themselves because of their teachers. And I'm sure that that does happen to some people, and that's valid. But in my case, both my regular teacher and the visiting art teacher were so proud of what a beautiful, realistic, personalized, individualized, creative tree I had made, that I think they even contacted my parents. And anyway, I was making this tree in the first grade, and I'm still making the same trees. I talk about my flower stitch being a habitual stitch for me. It isn't something that I did on purpose. It's just I would go to sew a flower and I would just start doing this. And in the beginning I was filling up the big leaves on those bloom flowers, and I started using it on smaller flowers when I started making them, even though you can't fit nearly as much on there. And truly your flowers could have just about anything quilted on them. And so it should be an expression of your personality and what you like to do. But if you make a shape and then start going around it, you can build it out and fill up that area that you need to do. And often you can make a fairly attractive block of color that you can then cut out on your raw edge applique. And so I recommend that you experiment with that, not just making one shape, but making a cluster or clump of them and outlining them, not all the same amount, but in different amounts, so that you have sort of an organic cluster of like shapes and get some nice organic flow going with the colors on your piece. Double outlining is something that I just have a tendency to do, and the first time that I quilted a bunch of purse tops, planning to paint them, I had just newly ordered paints. Because of the tendency to double outline, just because I like the way it looks, even unpainted, it always gave me a line that I could paint. And so now I tend to put one underneath of a shape, like the artichokes on a purse. I often tend to just, even if I go along the side, I just tend to come on to the quilting and then go off in a way that everything is doubled up. And it does give you something you can paint. And in the case where we're trying not to do too many layers, it's very helpful to have a nice little channel that you can paint. Say all I'm going to do is quilt around this shape. Now that's fine, and my stitch quality isn't the best. But now let's add a second line and see what we think. I think you can see that if I painted in here with, say, a pink, an orangey pink, like is in this fabric, this orangey pink color, if I painted in there, I've already got something pretty cool. And that's all I'm talking about, you know, and then I could do it so it's cell wall inside, and it's almost turning into a leaf. But you can see that it's pretty neat that way. And you know, I don't usually go around the cell wall. That to me is almost overkill, and then I would never paint something that tiny, so I don't do this. Although you certainly could. I just think it starts to get to where there's too much information coming into your eye and you don't see the shape that looks a lot like the vein on a leaf. Another thing I like to do with double outlining is put a wiggle in one of the lines. And so I often do a circle, and you'll see this type of a thing all over my work. Flowers. I think flowers are nice, and there's something that if you're making a piece and it just needs something, you know, you can put a few flowers. And if you've got an area that's got something bad going on and you need to cover it, you could put one flower, but you can also put 3 flowers or 5 flowers and kind of justify the flowers being there. I usually plan to put flowers, but then I plan to put them in the areas that somehow need help. Okay, so there are different ways to do it, and you'll just want to practice and figure out what ways yours are. For a long time I had a habitual flower, and I don't think they changed for 3 or 4 years really. And so it's 5 petals, and I'll just show you. And then they got more, I think, more artistic and more, some people might say sloppy over the years. But here's the habitual flower that I did for a very long time. Sorry, my elbow's actually bumping into the tripod. But this flower looks fine. But then I want to show you what it looks like if I double outline it. See, and I just think that looks so much more. It's not only bigger, but it's just more, it's more important. And when I trim it off, it's going to be so much more than just the plain flower, that you only have the shape for you to recognize what it is when you look at it. And with this you have double. And I don't think I would really paint this, especially if I had put 7 of them on something, but you could. I would be quilting a fabric that had leaves on it or scrolly shapes or whatever, and I would just start mimicking whatever was there. And what I learned was that if you fill a pot holder, this is much, I'm going to do much smaller than I would normally do on a pot holder because this is such a small space, but you'll get the idea. Say I do some kind of tendril plant shape. This is fine, and it could be lovely, but for me to make the pot holders really interesting, I liked to do this sort of thing, which I still consider double outlining, even though I did just outline it. There's my basic leaf, and what I used to do is fill up one pot holder with several different leaves, but I like it better if I do that. And so any kind of leaf that you're interested in doing, anybody that loves The Wizard of Oz or the Tolkien books knows how important trees are in our stories even.